Yeah, let's do. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Students, faculty, visitors, others, and welcome to the Digital Scholarship Lab. I'm Stuart McManus. I'm Assistant Professor of World History and the Director of the Digital Humanities Initiative at the Research Institute for the Humanities. Today's event, as you might know, is part of a new initiative run through the Research Institute for Humanities and generously supported by the library, which is hoping to bring digital scholarship and teaching to CUHK in a sort of new and vibrant ways. I'll just mention some of the other features of the initiative, just in case you're interested. Some of you might already know about the seed grants, which will be available both to faculty and to students to undertake digital humanistic projects of various sorts. These are going to be announced very, very soon, and I hope you'll all consider applying. Undergraduate and postgraduate students can also apply for a scholarship to attend Oxford University's Digital Humanities Summer School. This will be an all expenses paid trip and will help you writing your graduation or master's and PhD theses. So look out for posters about that. Another important element of the initiative is, of course, this talk series, which we are inaugurating today. We are very honored to have for this inaugural talk Professor Javier CHA, who is Assistant Professor of Digital Humanities at the University of Hong Kong. He is an intellectual historian of medieval Korea and a technologist, and has been involved in digital humanities perhaps longer than most. He's been involved in a number of very exciting projects, including the Big Data Studies Lab, and has published various articles at the intersection of digital humanities and medieval Korean history. Today, however, he's going to be talking to us on the topic of fine-tuning the historian's macroscope, data reuse and medieval Korean biographical records in Neo4j. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Professor CHA.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? You want me to speak louder? How about now? Is it? Should I put it up here? Hold it like this? Whoa. Should have tested earlier. Sorry. How about now? You good? Okay. Oh, thank you for that kind introduction, Professor McManus. My name is Javier CHA. I just started in the University of Hong Kong as the first hire in the Bachelor of Arts in the Humanities and Digital Technologies program, and in the Department of History as an assistant professor of digital humanities. Prior to moving to Hong Kong, I was also a faculty member in the College of Liberal Studies. That is our university, my former university's excellent liberal arts program at Seoul National University. And during my stay at Seoul National University for about 5 years, I received several generous grants and was able to operate something called the Big Data Studies Lab. So as I was introduced, I'm an intellectual historian of medieval Korea. I try to use digital and computational methods to study classical Chinese documents, but with more of a focus on something I'll get to eventually in the coming years. But so far in the last few years, I've done a lot of work with intellectual biographies. So text will come later. What I've worked on more so far, thus far, using digital methods has been biographical data, which is something I will talk about today. Back in the day, it feels like ages ago, I did my PhD fields in pre-modern Korean history, middle period Chinese history, so I know quite a bit about Song Dynasty history, if you want to talk about that, and also book history with a focus on early modern Europe and early modern East Asia. I've been a practitioner of digital humanities since 2008. Before entering this domain, before going to graduate school in the humanities, I was an amateur programmer, something I was really passionate about since I was in high school. And when I entered graduate school, one of my mentors, I will talk about him in a few slides, mentioned that I should keep those skill set alive, because there's something happening right now in the humanities, something called digital humanities. So I should develop these skills to kind of future-proof my career, and I think he was right. Since post-PhD, I also developed a new area called big data studies, and it's basically a medieval historian and a book historian looking ahead to the year 2100. It's not something I will talk about today, but if you're interested, maybe we can, after the event, we can talk about this. And if you're interested, you can go to my lab's homepage called bigdatastudies.net. We'll talk about what historical profession will be like in the future, in the years ahead, in the decades ahead, when data centers become our archives. Okay? But today, I will talk about mainly biographical data and biographical databases, and my journey in this particular area, subfield of digital humanities or digital history. So three main points. I will try to keep the talk as simple as possible. I will talk about the origins of digital Korean studies. It's something I really need to do. Otherwise, a lot of the things I talk about will not make a whole lot of sense without context. And then a set of challenges that I encountered in the past 14 years working with digital tools to produce good and solid and meaningful and interesting historical scholarship. And then third, I will talk about the notion of the macroscope, which has been proposed by information scientists and digital humanities scholars in the past 12 or 13 years or so, what this term means, and what my response is to this ongoing debate in digital historical research. So my entry into digital humanities kind of predates my entry into the PhD program before I even knew what this was. It happened when I was writing my master's thesis. I was a master's student interested in 18th century Sino-Korean literature at the University of British Columbia. And in the middle of writing my master's thesis, I ran into a lot of issues because I was interested in something about me. I like exploring obscure topics. I guess many of us with the research, we enjoy something that we personally find interesting that nobody else cares about. Because I was the only person interested in this topic, the University of British Columbia Library didn't have the primary sources I needed. So to access the primary sources I needed, I had to drive down to the University of Washington. It's about like 4 hours, maybe 3.5 if you speed, from Vancouver to Seattle, and pick up 1 or 2 volumes of this collection from the University of Washington Library. So you're only able to hopefully borrow or just read them or make photocopies on the spot, 1 or 2 volumes at a time. And that was how I prepared my master's thesis in 2004, 2005. And then something happened. This is the new version of this database, but in the midst of my writing the MA thesis, the first 500 volumes of this collection, this is the 한국문집 총관, 1,259 pre-modern Korean writers, right? Not all of them are intellectuals, right? But very prominent figures who left behind a substantial corpus of writing that have been digitized. So 2005, for the first time, the initial 500 was ready to go and went up online. So anybody with access to the internet and a browser was able to read material that required hours of driving to pick up the books that I needed. And then, as you can see here, this is something that we're all familiar with, right? When you have an online database, there's this box. This was enabled all of a sudden. It wasn't available to me before. So my research was affected. So in the middle of writing my MA thesis, I used to just focus on one or two important figures. And suddenly I got interested in concepts to see if certain concepts and some certain critical terms appeared across multiple volumes. Something like this was made possible. So even before being introduced to this idea, what is digital humanities, I was really, this experience made me really think, what changes when we have librarians, archivists, and hundreds of dedicated researchers who take printed materials like this that have survived to us across the centuries, scan them, OCR them, correct them, tag them, make an interface, and make it available for researchers online, because your research questions are affected by this change. Okay. I could also go on with more details about this, but I try not to, because I kind of got tired of hearing myself talk about the same stories over and over. But if you're interested in hearing more about what I just told you, there is a YouTube lecture about an hour long where I talk about the background to the creation of those databases in Korean studies and how it has affected my research over the years. But for the time being, I will talk about my journey in with this field called digital humanities or digital history. And there are several figures that I need to mention. It's inevitable because they are responsible for the creation of the resources that I use on an everyday basis. The first person I want to mention is my advisor's 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 advisor. So a long time ago, and those of you who are familiar with East Asian studies, Edwin Reich, our student, and also the first professor of Korean history at Harvard, his name is Edward Wagner. In 1964, there was this fateful meeting between Edward Wagner, who was just hired to teach Korean history, and a figure Korean scholar who used to be in Chinese history and then switched his field to Korean history, was Song Junho. They get together and Professor Song Junho proposes to Edward Wagner, Professor Wagner, that he's interested in exploring what more or less what Edward Wagner did with his PhD dissertation. So Edward Wagner's dissertation, published in the late 1950s, was a study of 3 sets of what in Korean historiography is known as merit subjects. These are basically roughly 30 to about 70, depending on which political event, high-ranking ministers who joined the right coup. So it was a study of elite structure of the medieval aristocracy in Korea, and focusing on 3 particular coups and tracing what happened to them, their background, and what happened to their descendants over time. And then this fateful meeting brought Song Junho to the Harvard Yenching Institute, where he proposed that, why don't we collect the roster, because all these high-ranking ministers in medieval and early modern Korea passed just like in China, the civil service examinations. The problem was that in the 1960s, the civil service examination roster was scattered all over the world. There were some in South Korea, some in Japan, some in the US. So he proposes to Edward Wagner that we should collect them and put them together and catalog them. And then Edward Wagner proposes to Song Junho that that's a great idea. Let's apply for a grant, but with one additional feature here. Let's use computers. Let's turn this into a digital database. Because there was a boom in the 1960s, just like right now. We talk about digital humanities today, 1960s in the United States. It was very fashionable to bring in computing power into research areas, all kinds of things, including the humanities. So Edward Wagner proposes that we create this thing called the Munka project, what later becomes known as Munka project. Munka is Korean for the higher civil service examinations. That becomes a database. There's also this figure, I need to give credit, Kim Hyun at the Academy of Korean Studies, somebody who used to be a specialist of Korean Neo-Confucianism Then in the 1980s, becomes interested in Korea's text encoding issues and the creation of digital dictionaries. And over the years, thereafter, he becomes responsible for creating various types of database schemas that are utilized in all kinds of Korean digital databases. And I mentioned just some names first, okay? And then personally, when I entered this new area called digital humanities around 2008, this was a turning point in many ways. In the kind of training I received, I was very fortunate to be able to attend what many of us who participated in this, we call this a boot camp, the network analysis boot camp at UCLA IPAM. We can talk about who funded this and what kind of training we received there, but then I just want to mention a few names that I got to meet. Some of them are speakers, some of them are participants, and as you can see, some of them are now pretty established scholars in the digital humanities world. So Tim Tangolini was the person who organized it. Kathy Berner, I will mention her several times today because she's the one who is, I give credit for making this term macroscope something that we discuss very often in the digital humanities world. She's the one who proposed this term, even though she's not the one who coined it. And Scott Weingart, many of you might be familiar with his co-authored book, The Historian's Macroscope. So again, Macroscope, which is also referenced back to Kathy Bonner. And Scott Weingart was recently hired by the NEH to promote digital humanities scholarship in the United States a couple of weeks ago. And then there's Hoyt Long, who does digital scholarship in Japanese literature, and Ian M. Miller, who was a background in math. So as a historian, he picked up network analysis and highly advanced methods like topic modeling, and was able to do some really interesting work in the context of Qing Dynasty historical scholarship. These are all names I will mention. There's a reference back to my experience in digital historical research and the training I received. And of course, I need to mention Peter Ball. Many of you must be familiar with the China Biographical Database Project at Harvard University, and his good friend who recently retired from UC Irvine, Michael Fuller, who is a scholar of Chinese literature, but also somebody, again, with a background in computer programming. So he's the person basically who writes the code for automating parts of the China Biographical Database. Okay. So long story short, this has happened. And then in the meantime, something I discovered much later as I received various kinds of training and was exposed to and got to meet some interesting people interested in digital scholarship. This happened in South Korea. So something called the Asian financial crisis. There's this fear that this might happen again because the economy is not doing very well these days, right? So many of you might remember 1997, 1998. There was something called what South Koreans remember as IMF crisis. It was a major blow to not only South Korea's economy, but to their pride. And something happened in response to the crisis. There was this huge injection of funds, which was initially intended to be used for building physical infrastructure like highways and telecom networks and so on. But because of some complicated issues that I shouldn't get into, a lot of the funds was reallocated to be used in scanning cultural heritage materials. So as a result of this, hundreds of millions of US dollars year after year, for more than 20 years, was allocated to scan and turn heritage materials into digital databases. So this database that I encountered in 2005, it wasn't a coincidence that it just suddenly went up magically. There was money involved, there were people, there was people with vision, people like Kim Hyun, who was inspired by Edward Wagner, and Kim Hyun, who in the 1980s, by coincidence, was interested in building databases, interested in Korean text encoding, interested in encoding Sino-Korean texts, created database schemas, and built databases of this kind. There are also other types of databases. When I searched through the daily accounts the Joseon Dynasty, I no longer access them via print, but automatically go online. And I'm not the only one. Basically, I can say 99.99% of historians of Korea access our primary sources via a database. And there are all kinds of databases, hundreds of them literally, that are available like this, and we access them individually. And not only textual materials, but images and basically historical sources of all kinds are available online. And another interesting phenomena that I find is rather unique to Korean studies, and I hope that academics of other parts of the world can also eventually have access like this. In the US, the open access movement has been quite good, but not all countries. I know that people in Japanese studies have trouble accessing many databases because they're behind an institutional wall. But in the case of South Korea, it has been wonderful in Korean studies because something happened in 2011 to 2013 where any publicly funded digital project by law has to be made available online. So all those databases I showed you, those screenshots, the raw files can be downloaded. Okay. The reason I'm telling you all these details is because then the question becomes, should we limit ourselves to just doing keyword searches using the interfaces offered but officially by those institutions and access the data sets that way only? Or now that we can download all these things, the raw files, and there are hundreds of them, can we do something more interesting? Okay. Let me switch gears a bit and talk about some recent interesting scholarship coming out in the digital humanities field. This is not Korean studies anymore. This is strictly more digital humanities that have been inspiring me to approach things differently. Just what I just told you about, you have access to all these raw data files. What interesting new things can we do? So I turned to some interesting scholarship coming out in the digital humanities domain to see what interesting new research questions I can explore and try to think about some creative new ways of using those digital source materials. Okay, so for those of us who have tried using digital humanities methods, we know that it's not a matter of just learning how to use Python, learning how to use Gephi, and just plug in data sets, right? That is what you do when you go to a tutorial session, right? A good digital humanities project has some interesting research questions and engages with some interesting research output coming out in the digital humanities field itself. So to give you a summary of some things I found rather fascinating coming out in this scholarship, I turned to Franco Moretti's notion of distant reading and a further exploration made by Matthew Jockers called macroanalysis. And also, I'll just introduce the titles first and then mention what I find interesting about them. Something wrong with my PowerPoint. Okay, there was a slight problem with my PowerPoint versioning, but it's okay. I added a label, but it disappeared for some reason. There's also Catherine Bode in Australia and Andrew Piper with the German literature. Ted Underwood, who argues that we should digital, so he's not as interested in digital technologies, but argues very strongly that humanities scholars should take the quantitative turn seriously. So quantitative methods shouldn't be something that only social scientists do, but it's something that humanities scholars should take seriously as well. And then what I found interesting about this new scholarship coming out, and especially from people outside of the United States, is that since Moretti, right, there's this sense of optimism here that, or how should I put this? When you read macroanalysis and Franco-Moretti scholarship carefully, there's this sense that the corpus that they're analyzing is a good representation of the entire thing that they want to examine. Okay, so I don't want to pick on this too much because that's not the main point of their research. But what has happened in the last couple of years in digital historical research, especially in computational literary studies, is that some scholars have started to point out that there are such things as sampling issues when it comes to data-driven research. This is something that was pointed out not only in non-English language scholarship, but right away with somebody like Catherine Bode, who does Australia. And in Australia, when you study novels, one thing that Catherine Bode pointed out was that Australian novels tend to be serialized in newspapers. So when Catherine Bode started her digital humanities research, she began with scans. So already people like Ted Underwood, Jockers, they relied on databases that were scanned for them by librarians or archivists, right? Their main database was something called Happy Trust. Those of you who are familiar with digital humanities must have heard of this database, right? So database building or creating a digital archive was not their main concern. But right away, even in English literature, if you want to study Australian novels, scanning was the first step. Sampling was something that she had to really address, right? How representative is her data set when it comes to Australian novels, right? Andrew Piper is slightly more complicated, so I will just skip for now, but also this is something that was pointed out by Hoyt Long, who works on Japanese literature, right? So with modern Japanese literature, Hoyt Long has run into copyright issues and very limited access to digitized source materials, right? But he still has made some very interesting arguments. It's a very rich and complex book, but one of the first things that he points out, if you read the book carefully, is sampling again, right? How representative is the digitized material that he analyzed with very advanced computational methods? Okay, I will come back to this as well. Yeah. Now let's jump to this notion of macroscope, which is the main subject that I want to discuss in today's lecture. Yeah. So this idea of the macroscope is introduced to digital humanities scholars via Kathy Warner, roughly around 2000 to 2011. But the term itself, as many terms go, is not coined by the person who makes it popular, right? So if you dig up, you can always find somebody older who has used this term before. So in this case, macroscope, you can also trace it back to, I don't think it really gained much currency in the 1950s, but a historian named Philip Bagby did mention this, and he described it as this way. Macroscope is an instrument which would ensure that the historian will see only the larger aspects of history and blind them to the individual details, maintain this higher level of abstraction, and decipher the principal patterns of historical change. Okay, but if you bring this to the context of digital historical research, ideally your software tools should do this for you, right? But I think for many of us who have used digital tools to do historical research, we know that this is not easy to implement. Okay? And the person who actually made the term gain currency is the information scientist, Kathy Berner, in 2012. And she defines the macroscope as something that provides, and this is very important, I think, vision of the whole, right? Helping us synthesize the related elements and detect patterns, trends, and outliers while granting access to myriad details. Okay, so right away you can see that this notion of distant reading is kind of implied here. You want to see the whole picture, but also be able to zoom in and out, see the details, right? Again, when you actually want to implement this using software or using code, it's not that easy. Okay, we'll come back to this again. So you see that this is how it was introduced, Kathy Berner, and it was picked up by, again, Tim Tangolini I mentioned was the person who organized the famous UCLA workshop, 2013, picks up this notion from Bonner and brings it to his own domain, which is Scandinavian folklore. And it's also picked up by Skye Weingart and also famous historians here, right? Sean Graham, Ian Milligan in 2015. And the book is literally called The Historian's Macroscope. And the book is about using digital methods to do interesting historical scholarship. And here, their definition of a macroscope is a different set of tools for exploring at different scales, data sets in different scales, observe what is at once too great, show, or I think there's a typo there, or complex for the human eye and mind to notice and comprehend. So this is a way of legitimizing the use of digital tools to do scholarship, because when you have access to so much information, you need the aid of something like a software-driven macroscope to do this kind of research. So now let me come back to what I've done over the years in the context of Korean history and talk about how the way I have been building the historian's macroscope for medieval Korea has changed over time. So my introduction to digital humanities was not only through that MA thesis experience in 2005 and being able to access that database, but also a seminar paper I wrote in graduate school. So when I first entered a PhD program, this was basically kind of like, I still kind of jokingly call this my rite of passage. This was what made Peter Ball remember my name. So in the seminar paper I submitted to Peter Ball, I had this very, I don't even know what to call it, very rudimentary social network, quote unquote, analysis. Because what I observed was, this is 15th century court academicians in Korea. And I didn't use digital methods back then. It was a very old school standard intellectual history seminar. But what I noticed, and it was purely by chance, was that I looked through the intellectual biographical dictionaries of these figures, and I found all kinds of interesting connections among them. So I didn't know what to do, but I thought it was interesting. So initially I drew them by hand on a piece of paper. And eventually I used Word table because I have background in web design. I figured I should just use table borders to kind of like demonstrate, visualize the connections among them, right? Kinship connections, intellectual connections, political connections, and so on. And then later when I learned digital methods, I initially it was very tough. It was before open access law was formally legislated in South Korea. So very difficult, but eventually I got a hold of Edward Wagner's civil service examination database. And for the first time, because I had access to a piece of software that Wagner didn't have in the 1960s, for the first time I used Edward Wagner's database to do something new and interesting. So this is the civil service examination database of Korea, 1392 to 1469. And I used Gephi to visualize the kinship connections amongst the civil service examination candidates. And I found that they are heavily interconnected. Okay. And not only the civil service examination database, but I had also, of course, access to other kinds of sources like the oldest surviving genealogy of Korea, the Andongkwon genealogy from 1465. This edition is very important because genealogies tend to be forged by descendants. It's always good to have access to the oldest authoritative edition, something that you can trust. So 1465 edition of the Andongkwon genealogy, I also partially digitized. And also something that is tricky to, I mean, you can also carve and try to add false information here, but highly unlikely that this could be forged. So tombstone inscriptions, epitaphs, the collection of epitaphs also digitized, and started doing some interesting work. And then I ran into another problem. So digital historical scholarship is always throws with curveballs. That's what makes it really interesting, but also it's not an easy domain to enter. Right? And I can maybe tell you during the Q&A, but there are some papers that I've I've been sitting on for like more than 10 years because I have interesting visuals, but I'm still trying to figure out from a historian's point of view, try to produce a paper that is meaningful from the perspective of a historian who sees digital methods as optional. Okay. Well, the curveball is that when you learn network analysis, they usually use data sets that something like intellectual networks, and the most common one is Twitter retweets or Facebook friends, right? But when we study social networks, right, they teach you how to use degree centrality, eigenvector centrality to analyze friendship networks, okay? And friendship networks have, and this is one of the first things you guys do when you study Gephi, right? When you do the first Gephi tutorial, you use the Les Miserables character co-occurrence network, right? So what is the assumption often when you study Gephi is that a node can have high level of degree centrality because friendship networks means that each node potentially can have hundreds of friends, okay? But the curveball I encountered with my data set was that you cannot have 100 wives because my data set was a kinship network data set. Legally, a Confucian scholar had to observe the rights where legally you're only allowed to have one legal wife. Okay, so you have this like really interesting data set with restrictions being observed because of social norms, right? At the same time, if you look at, if you think about how aristocratic marriage networks work, is that you want to always find a marriage partner for your son or for your daughter, right? With somebody who is close to your family, but not to the degree it's too close. You don't want the marriage to be incestuous. You don't want it to be too endogamous. It's a form of endogamy, but then something that, you shouldn't violate the norms, right? You shouldn't be a family who is too close. So what you see with medieval aristocratic marriage networks is that you find weird circular structures that you don't often see with friendship networks, okay? And there are ways to do some interesting things with it. You can use R to identify these circles. And the wonderful thing about digital humanities is that the Python libraries constantly become updated. So now these cycles, there is something called the network X. And in network X, you can just use this function to identify all the rings of networks embedded in your data set. So I've done research like this as well. And time series analysis, when you have a rich data set, is there a way to normalize and simplify and observe changes across centuries? So I work together with an undergraduate student who now is at MIT doing wonderful things in the PhD program to take the same Edward Wagner civil service examination database, but this is for the first time we got to see decrease in mobility post Hideyoshi invasions, post Imjin War 1592. And there's a way to quantitatively demonstrate this. But I also was not too satisfied with this approach. So it's only about like 1 or 2 papers I wrote over the years. And there's several reasons why I don't find this approach all that satisfactory. So one of the first things that I think needs to be addressed in digital historical scholarship is this idea of data. I'm not sure if that's the right term, quote unquote contamination. And what I mean by this is basically engaging in source criticism in the context of digitized databases. So when I have access to, so the way we access the civil service examination sources these days is always via some kind of a digital interface. But when you investigate from where those digital databases have obtained the information, things are very complicated. And I think most historians are familiar with this problem, right? So first of all, the examination database covers the time span of 1393 to 1896. The problem is that there was a devastating war in 1592 on the Korean Peninsula. For about 7 years, Hideyoshi's troops invade Korea, and it's totally devastating. So devastating not in terms of only human suffering and death, but also a lot of primary sources have disappeared, including, as it turns out, the civil service examination records. So right now, when we do research with the civil service examination records, we do analysis of this kind, and we just plug it into Python and run wonderful quantitative models and try to find patterns and try to see changes across time. And one of the things that we identified in this paper was, oh, there was a radical shift pre-1592 and post-1592. But is it because this is some sort of social change, a drastic social change happening pre or post-1592, or because of the nature of the sources itself? So it turns out the examination records in Joseon Dynasty Korea was reconstructed post-1592 out of memory. Okay? And basically, nobody who uses the examination database has pointed it out before until Professor Park Hyun-soon at Seoul National University pointed this out. So can you trust the records for the pre-1592 materials when the entire thing was more or less reconstructed out of memory after the war? Okay. And there are also the issue of editions, which is something that many historians are familiar with, something that we're trained to take seriously. And also, this is the contamination part. Every researcher, every historian who's interested in digital scholarship, we make our own personal editions of these databases. Okay. So this is Javier CHA's version of the Korean examination records. This is Park Hyun-soon's edition of the Korean examination records. And there are dozens of other historians interested in the Korean examinations who make their own personal databases. And then there's this problem too, something called data heterogeneity, that whether they're digital or not, sources come in many different shapes and forms. And also the way sources have survived really varies across time. So one thing I point this out in detail in an article I wrote in 2018, but I'm a medievalist, so I focus, my specialty is 12th to 15th centuries. But something happened when I got interested in digital historical scholarship. I kept finding myself focusing on the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And the reason I kept turning to this time period is because of the bias in the way sources have survived. So if you tally up in terms of like the total amount of writing that has survived, this is how much we have for 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And this is how much we have for pre-1592. Again, some of it might have to do with the war, but some of it has to do with the way record keeping worked in pre-modern Korea. Okay. And one last thing that I found not so satisfactory, which was also pointed out by other digital historians, it's not just me. So say, for example, a project like this, a wonderful project, Robert Nelson, who digitized a local newspaper in Richmond, Virginia called the Dispatch to study slavery. Okay? And another digital historian who I respect, a good friend as well, who ran topping modeling on the Qing Shulu to study rebellions and violence in Qing Dynasty China. There's something about digital historical scholarship that tends to focus on one set of primary sources exclusively, as if we are literary scholars. Right? But I think if you look back to the kind of scholarship that have been produced in the last few years, there are literary scholars who are interested who use very advanced quantitative methods to study the corpus. But in my case, as a historian, I'm not so interested in using, so to me, the corpus is not the object of my research. But I think for most historians, the primary sources are a means to investigate a phenomenon that is not in the corpus. Right? So how do I change? How do I reorient this? right? How do I make sure that I use digital methods, I use these cool tools, I use these data sets, but then try to get at something much more interesting, right? And I think the first step in doing that is learning how to connect the disparate and heterogeneous elements in the sources that now, at least for Korean historians, can be downloaded free of charge. Yeah. So the solution I propose is using a database management tool called Neo4j, database management system called Neo4j, which is graph-based. And basically what it does is change the way we approach the sources. So normally when you learn computational methods, when you learn, say, for example, how to do network visualizations, you use a data set, usually one set, one common set of primary sources, digitize it, clean it up, and then load it onto something like Gephi, Cytoscape, and then what you do after a while is like you start with a small sample, like maybe 1 century, and then increase in scale, right? This is, I guess, think about all the definition of the macroscope, right? So far, when you use computational methods to study historical materials, there's this tendency to just make it as large as possible. China Biographical Database has a tendency, and I also ran into this problem. I get to like even the time period that I don't even work on, like all the way to the 19th century, just to see the whole thing because I can, right? So macroscope has become the approach that we tend to take very often is just try to see the whole thing. But then if you think about the various definitions of the macroscope, it was meant to be flexible, right? It was meant to zoom in and out, not only see the whole picture, but also focus on the details, try to identify some elements, or in the case of BACB, even before digital tools was introduced to historical scholarship, the details have to kind of blur out so that you can identify the patterns and trends, right? But the tools that we use in digital historical scholarship tend not to do that. There are some workarounds. So if you have a specific node in mind, say in the context of network visualization, you can use something like Cytoscape and then do adjacent node and edge selection and try to find some interesting subsets that is kind of buried in this hairball, right? That clearly has a pattern, but then you're not really sure what you can get out of this. So if you happen to have specific nodes that you want to zoom in on, then you can do some selections of this nature. But it's, again, function-wise, is kind of limited. The China Biographical Database offers this tool because it's natively not a graph-based database, it's a relational database. So in order to do social network analysis, you need to run this Visual Basic Application tool that runs a script and goes through the hundreds of thousands of records that it has to create a network data set for you. But if you so if you use something like this Python script I came up with, and do this run beforehand on this heterogeneous collection that you have. So in my case, I use something like 30 to 40 different data sets. And what is really interesting here is that among them are basically 12 different types of examination databases. My own, and Parkinson edition, and somebody else who also tweaked it, put them all together. So this run, the iteration, happens beforehand, and then you can load them all to a database management system that is natively graph-based. Okay? So you generate about 30 to 40 different CSV files that already ran through did the iteration beforehand, and then you load it onto load the CSV files as nodes and edges on Neo4j. And there's also a plugin called APOC. So this is something maybe we can talk about during the Q&A, but there are extensions and plugins you can use in Neo4j. There's something called merge nodes that you can use to identify any nodes that appear to be the same node and put them all together so that nodes that originally come from maybe 20 different data sets can be treated as one. So why do I do all these things? Like, why does a historian do weird things like this? Because it can be incredibly powerful. Okay? So some of the sources, so just because I'm a historian of Korea doesn't mean that I only work on historical figures who are ethnically Korean. Some of the figures that are important for my research are Jurchen, some of them are Manchu, some of them are Chinese, some of them are Mongol. They're relevant. They need to be connected to my database, right? So the sources can be from China Biographical Database. Some of them can be from my own personal databases. Some of them can be from the National Institute of Korean History. When you bring them all together, you can do some incredible things that I'm pretty sure if Edward Wagner was alive, he'll be quite proud of me, right? So Edward Wagner limited himself to the study of 3 sets of married subjects, but I try to do something much bigger. And it turns out that married subject investitures, we have the entire 100% of the records survive for about 25 of them. So I created a new married subject database personally. It's from the veritable records and also from the history of Korea. I loaded them onto Neo4j, and you can do searches that kind of you've never encountered searches like this before. So something you can do is basically like you have 40 married subjects from 1469. Just for the heck of it, you want to see their connections to married subjects 1327. Is there any connection between those 40 and this 25? And Neo4j can return the results in a second. There's something called, we can maybe talk about this so later during the Q&A, but in Cipher Query, you can do it as by just typing the syntax correctly, but there's also something called self-graphball. This is also an APOC extension you can use, and you can do something like this. This is a demo I did. So between married subjects of 1467, 1469, and 1589. Any interesting nodes that have long connections, show me, right? So I found all these things, and then you can zero in on something that looks interesting to you, like this person who I've never heard of, this person who is really famous, right? And right away, you can see the connections, right? So the idea is that, you know, I think there's some further things like I need to do here, but I think with the help of Neo4j, at least I'm taking the step in the right direction. Okay, so it's not the idea. The idea is not to like go, okay, I made a new married subject database, so let's visualize it in Gephi. Let's load them all into this centralized system and see if we can run some interesting queries. And again, as what Macroscope was supposed to do, be able to see the whole picture. But as you see here, you can also zoom in on some interesting details that you might discover. Right? So you can actually use the digital methods to do real exploratory analysis of your historical sources. Okay, so I will stop here and thank you for listening. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Professor Cha, for that really tremendous presentation that took us from the beginning of your journey as a digital humanist, and indeed from the beginnings of the field, as it were, to the present, and pointed us towards possible future directions. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I certainly have a lot of questions, and it's good that we have probably have about half an hour to chat. I'm thinking that we might sort of maybe sit ourselves at the front and sort of
Sure.
Chat, if that would be if that would be easier. So maybe we'll just
sure.
grab some chairs. And then we would probably need a roving mic, I think, as well, in case people in the room have questions.
Oh, that's really fancy.
Yeah. Those of you who have joined us online, it's also great to have you with us. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I will be your voice, essentially.
Okay.
You in the room too, just raise your hand, and then we'll have Basma bring the mic to you. I might abuse my position as chair, however, to start off with a couple of questions.
Sure.
I want to sort of take things from two different directions. So I guess the first question, given that we have a lot of students here, is if you were starting again as a digital humanist, how would you start in terms of the skills you would develop, either particular softwares or particular even just ways of thinking, sort of approaching your topic? So that's the first question, and then I guess maybe we can sort of segue then into where you see things going from here. So you sort of, you showed the great example of this project you're developing. If you had infinite money in 20 years, what do you see a sort of a possible end product, or something that you could, aim for going forward?
Yeah. Wow, fantastic questions. Before I begin, I should also mention that I thought about doing a live demo, but decided not to last minute because live demos always go long. So I apologize. I didn't actually open Neo4j and show how the queries work. But eventually, I will write a programming historian article where you can do like a step-by-step tutorial and then follow the steps and just run. I can also provide a sample code so you can actually run Neo4j on your own computer. To answer your first question, I think it's a fantastic question. And I get that question actually quite regularly because I have students, undergraduate or postgraduate students who are interested in digital humanities and ask me, how do I start? What should I start learning first? I would say, I think it's come to the point where there is a body of scholarship you need to read. So it's not simply a matter of, learning how to code. That is, I think, it's a necessary part of your training now. And looking at this as somebody who, I wasn't so good, but I learned quite a bit of programming back in the day. It has become so simple and so easy now. Almost anything is possible. You can use your iPad to code because you can just use your Google account, log into Google Colab, and everything runs in the cloud. I think there's almost like no excuse not to learn. So learning basic coding skills, learning how databases work, necessary, absolutely. But there's also a body of research that is, I think, closely connected to your particular area that you need to study. So if you're literary scholars, if you're in English literature, Chinese literature, absolutely need to learn. You need to be familiar with the trends and the debates and the controversies that have occurred over the years, and also study a little bit about the origins of a particular subfield, because there are multiple paths to digital humanities, and depending on which specific area you belong to, the history of computing in your particular area is a little bit different. So if you are a literary scholar, you have to probably go back to Josephine Miles in the 1940s. It's not so much about Roberto Buzza, but you have to absolutely study Franco Moretti, Matthew Jockers. Even if you're in Chinese literature, you need to study them, right? And of course, Hoyt Long, Catherine Boat, these are all, I think, canonical literature now. You need to study them, right? So that you know what to do when you fire up your Google Colab or your Jupyter Notebook. Okay? If you're a historian, you have a different set. You need to know. You definitely need to know Robert de Buzza. You need to know something about Roy Rosenzweig and the abundance and scarcity debate initiated by Rosenzweig in the American Historical Review. If you're interested, I can send you a list of readings to do. Right? So just because you do digital humanities doesn't mean that what you always used to do in seminars and so on. You still need to do them. There's a lot of reading involved, right? in addition to coding and creating your own data sets, right? And becoming familiar with what kind of digitized materials you have access to, I think it's very important. Because you might have wonderful ideas, but then you might discover that the sources are not accessible to you. Then you just cannot do those, that you cannot do that project digitally. You'll have to use traditional methods, more or less. Okay? And digital is not all is the new shiny, but it doesn't mean that it's, you know, it's not panacea. It doesn't solve all problems, right? All problems you will encounter. In some cases, I think it's more appropriate to use non-digital methods. And in some cases, digital methods really help you investigate a phenomenon that would have been very tricky to execute otherwise. And the second question was
the future.
Oh, the future. Okay.
20 years and
20 years.
Infinite funding.
Infinite funding, yeah. I can maybe answer it this way. I was once asked by a senior scholar, like, what would you do if you were given like $1 million? And as it turns out, for digital humanities projects, $1 million US is actually not that much when you have a big project that requires a lot of labor, because it's not a matter of, so one, I think, mistake people tend to make is that when you think about digital humanities, people think about very fancy equipment, big computers. I think it's more important to have space like this. And I would say the lion's share of the money, the funding, should go to hiring staff and supporting students. Right? I think it's very important to communicate this to the senior administrators. The temptation, I think, usually is to get the multi-million-dollar funding and then buy equipment. As it turns out, thanks to the rise of the cloud industry, you pay only like a few hundred Hong Kong dollars and you can run all kinds of things on your browser, right? And cloud-based tools are popping up like almost every day. So new things are available. So just becoming familiar with them, I think, is really key. But being able to have access to funds that are given to people rather than equipment, I think is very important. And having a collaborative space so that there's ideas being exchanged, I think is very important. And interacting with engineers, I think you learn a lot because they're in the forefront of everything cool happening, but they may not ask the kind of questions that humanities scholars ask. So just having a few friends or inviting a professor in engineering to give a talk in a space like this, I think is very, very important. If we had unlimited funds, there are always new areas and it's very hard to predict where things will go. So in the case of pre-modern Korean studies, thanks to there you saw millions of dollars being invested, right? So I think it's safe to say that almost, I cannot like precisely measure how much, but as far as I can tell, almost everything pre-20th century has been digitized in South Korea. It's quite incredible. So we are already at that point, and those data sets are available on open access. So it's a matter of what new methods can we use. And I think Neo4j is one thing I'm proposing. One way the scholarship will change in pre-modern Korean studies is advances, I think, in computer vision and machine learning. So this is not my time period, but I know that for 18th to 19th centuries, one big challenge, which I think many historians would not want to admit, is that documents that social historians want to be able to access and read are written in short form. They're handwriting. So classical Chinese, learning classical Chinese is difficult enough. Being able to learn handwritten short form classical Chinese is an additional 10 years of training. But we already have computer vision models that helps you decipher them. I think this could be potentially revolutionary. So all those documents that historians had trouble reading, and only a handful of specialists who went through the 10 years of additional training was able to read and just make a database and make catalogs for you, are now historians who write narratives, who write books, can read them with the aid of a tool. And if you have it 92, 93%, 95% accurate, that's already good. Because for every 100 characters, you have maybe 4 misread ones, and you can just correct them yourself, because you can probably make a good guess as to what that might be, right? And I think that could be potentially huge. When it comes to the future of historical research, which is something I'm more interested in, I think this is something that, but I think I want to save that topic for another venue, because that is more about future historians studying the 2010s and 2020s. So you mentioned 20 years from now, what's going to happen? So somebody in 2040, a postgraduate student in history, studying the early 21st century as contemporary history. What kind of training, what kind of tools, what kind of funding is required to execute a project like that? That's something I'm interested in, but we'll see how things will go.
Thank you so much for mentioning that question of staff, especially as we're here in the Digital Scholarship Library, where we have some tremendous staff to help us. It's also worth mentioning, of course, that we run a Chinese OCR competition here, which brings together people from all over to try and sort of optimize that process. And then on the issue of collaboration, there is the data analysis practice opportunity. I think it's translated in English. This is an opportunity for students in the Faculty of Arts to collaborate with other students in engineering, as you mentioned, or in other faculties to undertake group projects. And what the humanists can bring really is that ability to ask different sorts of questions. Because what I think most of us are trying to do with digital humanities is not just, learn a new party trick. It's actually to gain new insights into the past. Do we have any questions in the room currently? Kind of maybe the mic over there, that would be great. And if you could say your name and affiliation.
Hello, Professor CHA. I'm CHA. I'm an art historian, but now I'm like on the way to become a digital humanist. Actually, thank you for your wonderful talk. I feel really inspired. Concept. It's really to see your work. Your work has been visualized in different layers. Because I'm used to be art historian, so my question is in my case, I often found I don't. So I think that that's also a challenge for most historians when they try to build their own database. They don't have enough data, which means this will result in incongruency of the model. So what's your opinion about this challenge? We don't have enough data.
Yeah, I think this part I should have made a little more clear during the talk. So one reason I turned to Neo4j was precisely because of this issue. So as a medievalist, I found myself being attracted to early modern topics because of this bias in how sources have survived. But I wanted to go back to the time period that I was trained to do and still use digital methods. I thought really hard, what can I do? So the solution I proposed was to increase the density of edges and to interconnect as many data sets as possible. And the result of that is what you saw with Neo4j. And the end goal is not to provide a statistical summary of all the data that we have survived, but to make new discoveries, to make exploration easy, right? So it is possible to have 40 or 50 CSV files, maybe eventually turn them into relational databases and do something similar. But every time you try to find connections, you will have to run it through a script. But if you have it as a graph database, you can run the query natively on the graph database platform and makes discoveries really easy. And increasing the connections as much as possible, I think, is one workaround to the problem. So in the case of our history, I would say if you have any textual sources that can be linked to your data set, then that could be one way. But that was the workaround I turned to eventually. Of course, if I go to an even earlier period, I think that introduces a new set of challenges. But then that would also, you will intersect with archaeology. Yeah. I think you can be really creative with this approach. Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I think in fact, I think there's more potential when you apply digital methods to non-textual source materials because of advances in machine learning. So it really depends on how you approach things. Like, is it about kind of like, so it's one source of inspiration for me when it comes to digital history is annal history. So if you look at some of the radical things that annal historians used to do in the 1970s, right, was pick up a coin and look at the composition, like how much gold and silver was there, and use that to extrapolate and try to figure out something interesting about some small town in France they were analyzing, right? So if you're analyzing the substance of the material, then there's intersection with the sciences right there, and you can use data-driven methods right there. If it's visual scans of material objects, yes, absolutely, yeah. And machine learning loves visual data more than anything. If anything, I think there's more you can do with machine learning with visual sources than with text materials.
Machine learning, because I have this problem because I use machine learning to try to build a model to identify the patterns in the images, but it's historic images. So like I don't have enough historical photos, so that's why the model cannot be, done work.
Yeah.
So I finally gave up this method, but textual method is really works smoothly because we have enough entries. Yeah, that's why I have this confusing. So.
I think eventually this problem can be generalized, and I think hopefully one day it will be great to have some sort of a big collaborative research project that involves engineers, because this is a small training data problem that I think requires input from engineering. I don't think it's something that we can resolve on our own. So if it's possible to do something truly across disciplines and also across multiple universities in Hong Kong, we can do like hopefully a CRF project at some point that addresses a challenge. When you have a small sample, can we do something? Can we train a model that is able to identify things that you're looking for? It's very challenging. Yeah.
Anything from our students as well? In relation to this question, it occurred to me that a lot of the data sets are produced within a sort of a national context.
Yeah.
Could part of the way of solving this problem of having too small a sample size be to look, say, at sort of, linking together data sets from, say, Japan, Korea, and China, I mean, I'm thinking, there's sort of shared traditions, shared writing systems, things like that. Is that maybe something people should consider?
That is also, I think, a potential workaround. So if you study calligraphy, you can certainly do that because post-UN calligraphy, China and Korea come out of the same tradition, but from what I know, Japan has a different tradition. So, but that also suggests that if you have Ming calligraphy samples, you can do style transfer to study Joseon calligraphy. So we can be very creative with methods like this, and you can do something like style transfer in machine learning. But you also mentioned nationally funding digital humanities. I think it's something that we need to also address, because this is something. So before moving to one of the reasons I came back to East Asia was that I found that it was much easier to find funding sources and grants as an East Asia specialist when I'm in East Asia. Because digital humanities is so dependent on public funds, it's much easier to justify it that way. The question is, like, if you work on Europe, if you work on Australia, if you work on Latin America, but you're based in Hong Kong, are you going to be given the same amount of funds as somebody who works on classical Chinese? Right? Or you can say vice versa. If you're looking for an ERC grant, but you work on Korea, and I found that it's not so easy to get an ERC grant to study, classical Chinese documents produced in Korea. It's much easier if you it's a little bit easier if you do something East-West comparison. I mean, it involves Europe and China comparison, or something bigger like China. But if you work on a relatively small country like Korea, it's much more difficult. And this is something that I think we need to also take into consideration. Right? We're kind of going back to thinking nationally because we rely so much on public funds. It was the same thing in South Korea. I know there were some U.S. historians or European historians who were quite frustrated because it was very hard to find funding to do the kind of research they wanted to do, because there's so much funding allocated for Korean or East Asian topics.
Well, that's a very important point, that there's this very significant overlap between digital humanities and public history. As you say, many of the large data sets or databases produced do come from these, sort of national, regional, state projects. And the output that people are often looking for is something sort of public facing for that particular local or political community. So something obviously we also have to take into account when we're using the data sets produced by these projects, when we're using them, at second hand, as it were. And I think you made that point really well. So I think we have a sort of a somewhat related question on data cleaning. This is something that the students learn in my class. There's a lot of work to be done in these projects.
Yeah.
Is it by definition collaborative? Are you a one-man band, or do you have a sort of team of people working with or under you?
So I tell students that digital humanities is collaborative, but in my own work, I work alone. Mainly because it's very hard to find collaborators who are interested in my particular narrow area. Like I said in the beginning of the talk, I like obscure topics. Not many people are interested in what I research. But I did gain a lot from friendships. So I have many colleagues who generously share data that they personally spend thousands of hours cleaning, as long as we credit each other's work. And I also do the same. And I think building networks of trust in your domain, I think, is very important. There also have been cases where people take data sets without acknowledging properly, and that is really not cool. So I think a big part of digital humanities scholarship is collaboration and building trust and being respectful to each other's labor. And this is not only limited to the classroom, but in the academy as a whole. I think many of you, I think many of your students, right? So I know several of my students will stay up 2 nights, 3 nights, cleaning their data sets, work on it together. It's really not cool to, be a free writer in a team project. And once you have it ready and you are, you demonstrate something really meaningful, very interesting, I think it's a good practice to share it in something like GitHub or any kind of a public data sharing platform. But when you use somebody else's data set, I think it's the right thing to do is always acknowledge it. Right?
Absolutely, that's an excellent point. Maybe moving on to something a little bit different. And you gave us a teaser at the beginning when you talked about your big data studies project, and I think it's easily Googleable. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because that sort of brings us into more contemporary topics.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe I can just show how the website looks like. It still says Seoul National University because I haven't updated it yet. And if you're interested in joining my lab as an undergraduate intern, I welcome. I always pay my interns. So if you want to be paid to study, you're welcome to join the lab. How do I share the screen again? So this is the website. You see, I still haven't updated. It still says Seoul National. I should say Hong Kong there soon. I have some faculty associates. I have an industry partner based in Singapore that does text analysis. And these are my wonderful undergraduate researchers. I co-authored a paper with her, will be submitted soon. I had team members in Copenhagen who helped us read materials in Norwegian and Danish. I have former developers who joined us. She was based in India, now works for Julia Computing as a machine learning researcher. She used to work at Microsoft, went to Oxford in social data science, and now works in healthcare using machine learning methods. This is one of my co-authors I mentioned that used to did an undergraduate major in physics, wrote a paper with me, and then now he's in MIT. And Eugene Zhang was one of my first members, one of our lab's first members, very early on joined us and moved on to become a PhD candidate in USC in communication. Also have an international advisory board that have been helping us over the years. And these are the research areas. I kind of put them divided into 4 major topics, but I'm gonna add some new things. I wanna add blockchain and a couple of other topics to this again. So one of the things that we explore is basically the medium itself. So one of my PhD fields was book history. So it's not simply about, so as a historian, I don't simply take information for granted. It's not simply about the writings on a piece of document. It's more about, I also investigate reprints, how the sources have survived to us, and what kind of paper was used and how it was printed, the context in which the source was produced. You can do something very similar with today's servers and personal devices. The one thing that it makes big data very interesting and digital media very interesting is that digital media doesn't last long. So whatever data you have on your smartphone, say one day a historian picks it up 100 years from now, is able to somehow unlock your phone and access your information, well, actually cannot access, because after about 10 to 15 years, the data on your phone will be automatically erased. It is really bad at holding information in the long term. So we investigate that. So to have digital archive in the future about us today, we need to start thinking about archiving data today. it really reversed like the way we think about what primary sources are about. It's not about serendipity. It's not about somebody that nobody intended to have people in the 21st century in Hong Kong to read some 15th century book from produced in Korea. That doesn't happen anymore. Only archives that we consciously allocate for long-term preservation will be accessible in the future. So that's something we investigate. Another topic we investigate is environmental impact of big data. So when you have large amounts of sources, and especially with digital sources, it requires electricity. So you don't really notice this when you have one laptop or one personal device. But when you have 100,000 servers, energy becomes an issue. So energy is another topic that we investigate. And machine learning is essential. So what kind of machine learning methods, what subsets of machine learning methods is to be applied to historical research or in the humanities in general? That's another topic that we're interested in exploring. And about virtual reality and time, but it goes into something that's very sci-fi like, but it's a very cool topic. And there is a paper that we completed. So I completed that with my former undergraduate researcher about changing notions of time in an age of big data. So we are interested in more philosophical issues like that as well. So if this is something that you find interesting, it's a very different approach to digital humanities, but I kind of see this as the next big step that we need to take in digital humanities research. So the inspiration for this came from a conversation I had with Lev Manovich. So those of you who are very serious about digital humanities may have heard of Lev's, may be familiar with Lev's work. So one thing that Lev pointed out when I said I was so excited about learning Gephi, learning Python to do historical scholarship, one time he asked me, are you ever interested in contemporary matters? So this is my response to Lev's criticism, saying, you know, why don't you bring a historian's perspective into some issues that we encounter in the 21st century? So this is my response to something that Lev kind of mentioned in passing. So if you're interested, welcome undergraduate interns or even postgraduate students who are interested in working on some papers together. Welcome that. And I used to have an event series, which I hope to resume in Hong Kong as well. So if you see something like deepfake geography, we invited Matthew Kirschenbaum, talked about blockchain in the context of archival sciences. So not just about cryptocurrency investment, but using blockchain to make long-term preservation and also critical perspectives on big data and things of this nature. So if you're interested, welcome to join us.
Great. So there are so many things, I think, to look forward to in the digital humanities space here in Hong Kong. And I hope a lot of you can join us. So we're just about out of time, I think. All that remains is to say, I hope you've enjoyed this inaugural event. We will be hosting virtually Megan Gooch of Oxford University on October 5th.
Oh, that's a wonderful idea.
Yes. And she's going to be talking a little bit about what they've been doing in Oxford over the last couple of years. It's really quite an important center for digital scholarship. But all that remains, I guess, then is to thank Professor Cha for his wonderful presentation and to wish you all a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.